Well, good morning, and welcome to the My God, Did He Actually Say That show. And today, it is my special pleasure to welcome LBC's very own James O'Brien. Last week, our hero James ran a special 1-hour interactive show dedicated to Boris Johnson's comments on the boycott movement against Israel. James promised us a balanced broadcast, so let's hear him.
In reality, or you were at least, Sandra, this is what balance sounds like. It's possible both sides have done bad. It's possible both sides have a point. But when it comes to the internationally recognised illegality of the occupation, what are people opposed to it supposed to do to bring pressure to bear upon the illegal occupiers? What?
Well, that is interesting, James. Balance. I did spend some time looking for a definition that suits what you are proposing here, but I didn't actually find one. It does actually sound more a little bit like bias than it does balance. I'm also intrigued by your illegal occupation comment, but I'm sure we'll have time to address that later. As for balance, you have just spoken to a Jewish person who hates Israel, and a round of applause due to your production team for making sure she jumped the queue. And you spoke to her politely and you listened to her views. Let's see if you carry that sense of fairness through to the next caller.
Be an interesting intellectual somersault to have undertaken. Keith's in North Finchley. Keith, what would you like to say?
Yes, good morning. Well, the thing with regard to the BDS is that there's two things. First of all, the Palestinian Authority itself are against the boycott. That's the first thing.
Do you know why?
Why? Because they don't believe in the boycotting of Israeli goods for furthering something that is not going to make any difference.
No,
now, the BDS,
that's not why.
Well done, James. Keith managed to make it a whole 6 seconds before he was interrupted. And all he'd done was point out that the Palestinian leadership opposed full BDS. Now, excuse me for being thick, but I would have thought that in a discussion about whether or not BDS was required, what the Palestinian leadership do or don't want is rather important. And the fact that the Palestinian leadership don't want BDS, in my mind, is kind of the end of the argument. But James O'Brien thinks differently, and having interrupted Keith, James now wants to show us just how informed he is on the conflict. Well, go ahead, James.
Not going to make any difference.
No,
now, the BDS,
that's not why.
The BDS...
That's not why. Let's make sure we're dealing on first principles. They feel it would undermine their negotiating position. It would disincentivise the
whatever
process.
Reason you're going to come out with.
It's not me. It's them. It's them.
They are specifically against the BDS. Now,
but it's important to understand why, isn't it?
I think it's
first principles, no less. To which I suppose he means facts. James suggests it's important to us to understand why the PA oppose boycott, and goes on to suggest that the Palestinian leaders believe it would undermine the Palestinians' negotiating position, or in other words, cause problems in any peace talks with Israel. Again, it seems kind of obvious to me that anyone who supports a negotiated settlement would oppose full BDS outright, because now we have both sides saying it causes problems, which in turn makes it extremely odd that our hero James O'Brien thinks it worthwhile giving time to the BDS issue on a live radio show in London. What Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian president, actually said was that he does not support the boycott of Israel because they have mutual recognition with Israel, which again kind of implies Brian is feeding us with nonsense here. The actual reasons, of course, go way beyond this, and those, like Abbas, with a true understanding of the situation, know that BDS hurts Palestinians the most. The Israelis export science and technology, and BDS can only affect farming or factory produce, much of which is produced by the Palestinians. So BDS pushes Palestinians out of work and towards extremist groups like Hamas, making the Palestinian president's position weaker, which is why the Palestinian president opposes it and Hamas and people like James O'Brien support it. Abbas, whose job it is to look after the interest of Palestinians, sees BDS as an economic disaster waiting to happen. But anyway, James has chosen to fight Keith rather than listen to him, so let's hear how this conversation progresses.
For the purpose of supposedly forcing Israel's hand to some sort of peace deal or some sort of...
I'm going to have to clarify your statements, even though you don't like being clarified. The BDS campaign calls for, and I quote, various forms of boycott against Israel until it meets its obligations under international law. There's no notion of...
Let me explain to you. Let me ask you. You keep using the word... You laugh because of your typical... patronising attitude.
Yeah, that's right. That's what the people who started it... No, you're right. Why would we listen to the people who started the campaign when we can listen to Keith tell us why they did it? Go on, Keith.
James, I can guarantee you one.
Wow. Now let's get this exchange right. Keith suggests BDS push forward the notion that in some way they are trying to pressure Israel towards a peace deal. Something most of their supporters have here in the UK mistakenly think. And James interrupts. Positioning himself as a man carrying true knowledge, he states that he needs to clarify the BDS position and says that the BDS calls for, and then goes on to quote one sentence of their About Us page that actually sounds quite reasonable. He doesn't, of course, quote any of the less reasonable positions, nor expand on the actual meaning of the quote that he's just laid out. Keith then wants to explain further, not really being given a chance to talk, and James actually starts laughing at him. James then suggests he knows what the founders of BDS have said, and apparently they all agree with him. Clearly, James is not well read on Omar Barghouti, the actual founder of BDS, who openly suggests Israel need to be removed from the map and solely talks about a one-state solution. So having misrepresented BDS and misrepresented Omar Barghouti, James then suggests Keith is talking nonsense. At this point, to anyone who knows what's going on, Keith clearly has a far greater understanding of the issue than James, who is left simply poking fun and making up nonsense.
James, I can guarantee you one thing. I've been to the West Bank. Yes. I guarantee you haven't.
You're absolutely right, Keith.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
I've been there.
I've never been to Nazi Germany either, but I have opinions about that. I've never been to the moon, but I have opinions about that.
With regard, you use the terminology of illegal occupation under national law.
Right, Keith, I'm just gonna fade you down for a second for people listening, then we'll bring you back. This is the sound of someone who doesn't want the conversation to be had at all, okay? So you make a sweeping statement about why something is happening, you have it pointed out to you why the people doing it say they're doing it, you poo-poo that, then you go for the ad hominem attack upon the journalist trying to maintain a little bit of openness and scrutiny, and you start picking holes at him personally, using words like patronising, typical you've never been to the West Bank, as if that's relevant to anything. All the people living there, according to Keith's logic, suddenly have a better opinion about the issue than he does. And the final element of not wanting to have the conversation at all is making a sweeping statement about what it's designed to do, delegitimise Israel, and then completely ignore the stated aim of the campaign as explained by the people who are actually doing it. So,
well, there's too much here really to fit into one clip. This is simply incredible. Keith points out that our Mr. O'Brien hasn't actually been to the region, which is a fair point, although to be honest, one arranged trip by a pro-Palestinian group wouldn't enlighten him to the reality either. And then James actually involves Nazi Germany. I'm really not going to spend much time on the vulgar reference to those who committed genocide against the Jews, but it is a frequent tool used by radical extremists to somehow equate Israel to Nazi Germany, or to bring Nazi Germany into the conversation any way they can. It is as spiteful as it is inaccurate. James really shouldn't be bringing up Nazis in a conversation about Israel. Worse still, doing this to a Jew in London whose family may well have been impacted by the Holocaust. This was simply dirty. Keith then wants to address the illegal occupation issue, and this is another point that, as we will see, shows Keith's knowledge dwarfs James. But at this point, James actually silences him out, and then gives us one of the most hypocritical speeches ever heard on a radio station. Having drowned out Keith's comments, silenced him, ridiculed him, been unable to let him finish a sentence, and misrepresent entirely the true meaning behind the BDS position in an argument, James accuses Keith of being someone who does not want this conversation to happen. He even had the gall to suggest he was trying to maintain an open dialogue. That was simply stunning. Anyway, let's carry on.
Carry on.
Let me explain. The BDS is effectively delegitimizing Israel. We're talking about balance.
Oh, and then repetition. Ad infinitum.
Let me finish.
I wish you'd start, Keith.
Behind the microphone and press.
Here we go. More about me.
Let me finish.
Could you start?
Have a little bit of respect for someone who has an opposing view to yourself.
It's not a view.
Now,
I'm talking about facts.
I'm talking about the BDS. The fact of the matter is, if you want a peace treaty, you have to respect there are two sides to the argument. And what the BDS are not doing is talking about the fact that there are two sides to the argument. They're trying to force Israel's hand. They are not talking about the cessation of terror. They are not talking about the legitimate rights of Israel to exist. Now, that is called balance. No, they're not.
Yeah, oh, yes, they are.
They believe in the boycotting of all of Israel
until its responsibilities under international. No, of course.
In Holborn, you had people going into Sainsbury's in Holborn trying to clear foods off the food.
Have you ever been to Sainsbury's in Holborn, Keith?
Yes, I have. Thank you.
There you go. That's really relevant.
And what's irrelevant is the fact that I have been.
Okay. Look, Keith doesn't want to let go of the point because he hasn't been allowed to address it. And he knows James has misrepresented the entire issue. So James now takes to talking over Keith as he speaks. He even engages in a childish attack and has the cheek to suggest he is talking about facts. Keith then attempts to press home the idea that BDS do not accept Israel's existence, to which James suggests that they do. James even repeats it, before re-quoting the piece he mentioned earlier about continuing the boycott until Israel respects international law. So okay, let's address this fact directly. Remember, it is the main reason to this point Keith has been ridiculed and not allowed to speak. Now BDS has three stated aims, and it is point number 3 that is the most enlightening because it references GA Resolution 194. This is the resolution that Barghouti believes calls for millions of Palestinians to be allowed to enter Israel under a right of return. It's a non-binding GA resolution that extremists mistakenly call international law. They do so because it helps their cause. Now, in a two-state solution, Barghouti or Hamas style or BDS style, there would be a new Palestinian state and an Israel which has to get swamped by refugees under GA 194. That is, Palestinian refugees going to Israel, not to the new Palestine. This is the official BDS position. As I said, Barghouti, the founder, is a one-state man. He has no time nor place for Israel on the map. These extremists are not stupid, and they understand that calling for Israel's destruction will not play well in the West. So what they do is they leave it alone completely. BDS deliberately does not address Israel's existence. In his book, The Global Struggle for Palestinian Rights, Omar Barghouti, remember the founder of BDS, makes this point, that the BDS movement as such does not adopt any specific formula and steers away from the one state versus two states debate, focusing instead on universal rights and international law. Those rights and that law, of course, are GA Resolution 194 and the two Palestinian states. It's a con. So when James O'Brien says that BDS recognises Israel's right to exist and that its founders support this, he is absolutely wrong on both counts. He has done no research and he does not know what he's talking about. There is no other way of looking at it. And O'Brien has just spent the last few minutes publicly ridiculing a man who not only had it right, but knows more about the issue than James O'Brien does. It is simply nauseating. But trust me, there's more, so let's move on.
Relevant is the fact that I have been to the West Bank. You talk about an illegal occupation.
No, the United Nations does.
Sorry, James. I'm going to do one of your tricks now and I have to put you on mute. I'm sorry, but what? I deliberately passed over your comment earlier when you defined your balance. But now we have it exposed in all its glory. The United Nations did what? This type of comment is typical of the revisionist nonsense spread by extremist, even terrorist elements and pushed by BDS. It highlights just who James O'Brien is listening to and where he gets his information from. The United Nations does no such thing. It can't. The United Nations have already suggesting is that the United Nations has suggested Israel's occupation is illegal. What tosh. And yet so convinced he is of the fact in his statement, he's cut Keith off once again. So let's sit back and see just how far he's going to take this revisionist nonsense.
Tell me which resolution then, James. Come on.
What do you mean tell you which resolution?
Tell me how the United Nations says it's illegally occupied.
So you want me to sit here and Google the list of the United Nations resolutions concerning Israel and Palestine? Do you really want me to do that?
Yeah, no, I want you to tell me because you use the terminology. Tell me before you Google it.
I'll just Google it now.
No, you're Googling it. So what you're saying is you're talking out of your head.
No, I'm looking up recorded facts, Keith.
No. You're Googling.
Yes.
I will explain to you without Googling anything. You're probably referring to United Nations resolution.
Fade him down again.
242.
Fade him down again.
The most famous resolutions.
This is Keith now telling me what I think and what I base my thoughts upon. And then when I suggest politely that we look it up on a resource that we can both access and look at the historically recorded facts, he says, no, let me tell you what you think he says and let me tell you why you're wrong when he's describing a position I don't even hold. Carry on, Keith.
Okay, all right. Okay, so now here we have Keith asking James for specifics, because Keith knows that the UN hasn't called Israel's occupation illegal. But this isn't about what you think of the conflict, about what side you take, about whether you believe Israel oversteps the mark sometimes or has no choice but to do what it does. It isn't related to settlements, Hamas or Israeli actions against Hamas in Gaza. We're talking about facts, not opinion, historical facts. A word that ironically James is throwing about now in every sentence, despite the fact he does not know what he's talking about. Israel took the West Bank in a defensive war in 1967. Now, Resolution 242, which Keith references, specifically creates a formula of land for peace. No peace means no land. Israel's capture of the West Bank was legitimate, and its holding of the West Bank, it's recognised by the UN within many UN resolutions, despite the fact that everyone wants it to end. What James is confused by, as a man who has no grasp of the issues, is the UN's positions on Israeli actions within the territories, not the legitimacy of the occupation itself. He is throwing, that's James, his opinion about like a child. Yes, everyone wants a solution. Yes, some nations are harsher towards Israel than others. But the UN does not and has not called the occupation illegal. And yet here James is laughing over Keith, who hasn't really put a foot wrong. He's talking about facts. He clearly knows more than James does. And James doesn't know what he's doing. And yet James is still silencing him out again to make another speech about how Keith is the one in the wrong. This behaviour is disgraceful, it's ignorant, and it's vile, and the fact that LBC actually give this man a free rein is astonishing. Anyway, let's wrap this up.
James, the other thing is, you have an
Me again.
Israel.
Me again.
An obsession.
Me again.
An obsession.
No, I don't.
Why do you not talk about, for example, Turkey's occupation of northern Cyprus, or Turkey's...
Because Boris Johnson didn't cause a controversy in Turkey yesterday, and I don't live in a city, or rather I do live in a city where Boris Johnson is mayor. Just out of my description of what you were doing, trying to close down the debate, trying to ignore the facts, trying to turn it into a conversation about me, and refusing to listen to recorded historical events upon which we could both agree, and instead telling me why I think what I think based upon things I don't think. Is any of that unfair, do you think, Keith? Any of that representation?
Very easy to silence me out.
Very easy to silence you out, Keith. Finally something we can agree on. 10:46.
Well, that was a nice way to finish James, wasn't it? I mean, cutting him off again, silencing him, telling him he doesn't care about the facts. I mean, he tells you you're obsessed, you say you're not. I mean, you don't seem to know anything about Israel. I mean, you're generating hatred towards Israel and you're portraying it as being in the wrong as a default position. Look, I don't know why a man who doesn't know anything about the conflict, that's not available on a flyer handed out at universities, wants to talk about it so often. I mean, this is a question really that only James truly knows the answer to. But I do know he's taken someone here and tried to make a fool out of him, despite the clear fact that Keith knows far more than James does. And think about those listening. How many people today are more stupid, more ignorant, and armed with more incorrect details because they listen to this vile, ignorant put-down? And you know the truly dangerous part of this is people are actually dying today because of this conflict. Israelis are being attacked because rather than be pressured into negotiations, idiots with microphones are cutting off the pro-Israeli argument as if it does not have a case, talking over them, spewing garbage as factual information, and creating an image that Jews in London are blindly supporting an oppressive regime without reason or logic. From James' own definition of balance, you'd have to be extreme not to want to punish Israel, and yet he doesn't even know the simple facts of the conflict. Now we know there is a correlation between what happens over there and anti-Semitic attacks over here. We also know that terrorist supporters are spreading lies on campus. It doesn't take a genius to join the dots, although from the evidence on this recording James might not get it, about how an event like this, a recording, a show like this might affect the situation. Aren't we to expect just a little responsibility from those pushing opinions? Those pretending that to be a Zionist is to be an extremist, making up stories, and yes, you know, possibly inciting violence in the minds of vulnerable people already on the edge. It isn't a joke. And you know, the music his piece ends with, you know, they're getting away with it all my life. I have no doubt he smugly thinks he has, and it's disgraceful. You know, personally, I know many people who have already complained to Ofcom. The piece is vile, disgusting, and dangerous. Why on earth wouldn't they?